Okay, so I guess it's time it's now 12 o'clock, so I think I will start. Okay, so, welcome everyone. Tervetuloa kaikille. My name is Wataru, or as it says on the screen, walterinsect is my handle. I'm on Twitter, everywhere basically with this name. And my lecture here today is about what is canon these days. I'll be talking about the landscape of Japanese fandom, and especially about the creative side of stories, focusing on the markets surrounding doujinshi. I'll be explaining terms and what they are during the lecture, so stay for a little bit. So, I would like to hear comments and everything from you, whether it's comments, questions, criticisms, or hate comments. Hopefully not that one, but so I prepared this hashtag canon Japanisa to live tweet, comment, throw questions, everything to me. I might not be able to respond it within this time slot Desucon gave me, but I'm sure I will afterwards. I will look through, respond to any tweets you will make on this hashtag. So, canons and Japan. In this presentation, I will be talking about three main things. First, the fandom landscape in Japan with emphasis on derivatives. And second, the relationship between canon and derivatives that fans create. And the third, the aim is to give my limited explanation on post-2000s boom in the doujinshi market. But then I say limited because there are several things that limits this presentation. First of all, I'm not consuming all the otaku culture media. I focus on anime, game, Idol Master, Yuri Dojin, and novel Dojin and critique is one of my main diets as otaku, basically. And also, practically, there are just too many things to talk about. The scale in the current context is just huge, and historically, it expands from at least late 19th century all the way until now. And the sheer wide genre of doujinshi market kind of limits me to talk about things that I know, I dealt with, and I read. And so the starting point of this lecture is about two questions. First, since I'm interested in derivatives and because it's my main medium in this otaku culture, possibly more so than the canons from the official sources. And I'd like to see how the derivative, why fans create these things. Why create fanfics? Why create fan comics? And the second part is just the situation we have right now, where derivatives basically dominates the market. The number of doujinshi is increasing. The comic market, one of the biggest doujinshi events, is expanding in scale, venue, and duration. And I'd like to see why it's so expanding rapidly in last 10, 20 years. And also how the canonicity of the canons we have is how we can talk about it in the context of the market that's flooded by derivatives. Okay, so to put some that shouldn't show, good, okay. So to put some context into what we are talking about, I will quickly introduce one of the list of popular series or franchises that in Japan with regards to doujinshi market. Most of them are taken from the genre codes of the comic market, basically the categories of doujinshi circles that they apply to get the space. You have to specify which canon you are using in order to be placed in the correct category. And these are all canons that the genre code was split from the original overarching codes, and that means there are increasing number of doujinshi artists who apply for that genre. Therefore, it is an indirect sign of popularity among the doujinshi artists. And I'm not only talking about the popularities among the doujinshi artists. These list of series that we have here, with the exception of Yuri on Ice, there's a common denominator. That's what I wanted to do. Good. And that is the whole social game thing. I'm sure many of you are playing one of those the smartphone or mobile games that's based on one of these series, be it Love Live, be it Fate Grand Order. I'm sure these guys are playing right now. So these things, the social game is connected to all of these series except for Yuri on Ice for some reason. I don't have explanation to that, but I think it's enough to say that there's an increasing popularity of social game in this in the canon that we have in this otaku culture. Where am I? Okay. But then, how did we get here? Why is doujinshi a thing? Why is it expanding? I think I have to define the starting point of what doujinshi is. And we'll quickly go through the history of doujinshi and how it kind of evolved and how it arrived to the situation we have right now. So, when you hear doujinshi, what do you think of? Is it like lewd manga? Always R18? Or are they like leaflets for certain purposes? Because I love them, I brought some, but okay, one sec. Are they like this, like these thin leaflets that depicts anime girls in somewhat lewd ways? Inside is more lewd, so I'm not gonna show them, but then this is not the whole picture actually. Yes. But then the whole area of doujinshi spreads around much more than the thin leaflets for lewd purposes, basically. For example, this one. This is, I think it's pretty hard to see from back there, but I'm sure you can see how thick this thing is. It's a legit doujinshi I bought. This is a novel doujinshi about, I think, something like 700 pages. This crazy amount of page, the creation could be doujinshi. And it doesn't have to be comic or anything related to lewd manga. It could be a place to show your obsession to anything in this real world. This one, for example, it's pretty hard to see, but this is about sauna, basically. This doujinshi is filled with obsession with sauna by a Japanese guy, but then somehow using Gazan Panzer characters to show how awesome sauna is. Then it could be very research-oriented doujin activity as well. This one, for example, this is a book, doujinshi about Lotta Svard, which is, I'm sure you all know, the Lotta organization, the female organization during the war in Finland. And this one is practically the only book that you can get in Japanese about this organization. So in some ways, they're very research-oriented activities as well. So then, novels, like this big one. The critique, critique is a term that basically incorporates everything that you show obsession to. It's an overarching genre in Comiket that incorporates basically anything from sauna, traveling, railway, many things. But then this doujin business, It's a very broad term. This is because the whole thing started as a very wide thing to incorporate everything that happened, everything. And the term originated from the late Meiji era, and the term dojin means those who share interest and hobbies. The first part is onaji, so same, then jin, human, persons, so those who share interest. And this term was used to describe group of authors, poets, and creative writers publishing their private publications filled with their creative medium. And this dojin activity was very popular, almost dominant in poetry at this time, and also had a major position in literature as well. For example, some of the very famous authors like Ozaki Koyo, Natsume Soseki, Masaoka Shiki, these all participated in dojin activities at this time. Yes, here's one of the first doujinshi that was published in Japan, very old looking, called Garakta Bunko. This Garakta Bunko was published in 1885 by the author I mentioned, Ozaki Koyo, and contained everything from novels, poem, haiku, tanka, everything. And the manga doujinshi comes a little bit later. The novel, or these like high literature type doujin was a thing since Meiji era, but then the whole manga doujinshi starts in about 1960s. The activity became on rise around the mid 60s, where one of the manga magazines by Tezuka Production, the Tezuka Production being the company that's made by Tezuka Osamu, and this attempted to gather amateur manga artists to publish their work on their magazine, so that the magazine becomes a forum for many amateur artists. And with this context, there was a rising trend of youth publishing their own things separate from the commercial magazines that was on the market. So publishing just like these doujinshi, but more like a magazine filled with anything that they were interested in, called Minicom trend. This was a very popular thing in 60s, publishing very private leaflets among the youth. But then the project by this Tezuka Productions magazine quickly failed, as the magazine couldn't sustain its business. But then the amateur artists saw chances and the need for forums to talk about things, publish things, and publicize their work, basically. So this paved the way to first comic market that happened in 1979. This was the first comic market that happened, and this timing is very crucial because around this time, many of the major anime series started airing, like Space Battleship, Rose of Versailles, and many others. So with the rising anime trend and this the place to sell your doujinshi, any doujinshi, happened concurrently and had an effect on how the comic market becomes. The first comic market actually was dominated by the anime fanzines and the original manga from the amateur artists. And then this starts expanding in the 90s, mostly due to the computers being common things among people for tool for publishing. And the internet was slowly becoming a thing. And as a result, doujinshi expanded, and especially the yaoi genre is very important to mention because this this basically paved the way for more expansion for comic market. Especially the anime Captain Tsubasa was one of the significant work that led people to create yaoi doujinshi. Well, yeah. And then, as I said, comic market expanded its scale in terms of duration and also the venue they are using. Then we go into 2000s. By this time, the online community became a main place for otakus to gather, talk, and create, namely Nico Nico. I think last night, if you were here, there was a very interesting presentation about how Nico Nico culture became recently, but it's part of it, but the creative community and how the sheer number of it is very important when we talk about this topic. And also, the otaku is now, around this time, slowly becoming a mainstream culture, like Densha Otoko, a live-action drama, where it was based on two-channel, anonymous anons on two-channel becoming a live-action drama on a TV. That was a crazy thing. And new generations of audience grew as with the mind that otaku is now a thing. Well, otaku is a mainstream thing you can enjoy. And before this, in 90s, there was a social pressure towards otaku, triggered by several things, but mainly kidnap and murder of small girls, where the suspect was depicted as basically a pedophile, which wasn't really a case, but this otaku, and they were connected to his otaku hobbies, which gave way to society becoming very harsh on otaku. And this kind of waned in 2000s. Where am I? Here we go. So this is basically the history of doujinshi, very rushed version of it. I will talk about Nico Nico and Pixiv and some other tools in a little bit more detail later, but for now I will go into the actual main part of it, which is Nijisosaku, or derivative works, and how they relate to the canons that we have. So I'm using this term derivatives every time, and with difficulty pronouncing the word itself, but what is it actually? So for I think there are lots of different definitions you can use, but for the purpose of this lecture, I will be using this definition: any fictional work that has fictitious source materials. Now there are lots of problems with this, but I will address that in a little bit later. And this term nijisosaku seems like it originates from a legal text, especially the Japanese copyright law, where describing about the derivative works based on copyrighted materials and how they have to be regulated. But I don't have proof on that, but it sounds to me that this term has a very strong relations. And there's several similar concepts used by many different people. For example, transformative work, which I think is very, very good concept, used by the Archive of Our Own, or AO3. If you're in fanfic, I think you know what they are. It's an online forum for fanfic novels that's run by NGO called an Organization for Transformative Works. And in philosophy, there are other terms like simulacra, especially important in talking about postmodern theories, which has flaws in every direction. But namely, the French philosopher Baudrillard used this simulacra concept to explain how derivatives are flooding the world. And as opposed to the Nijisosaku derivative works, we have canon. Canon is hard to define. I will say why. But I will just say they are original work placed in contrast to the derivatives. And they usually have authorities over other derivatives for being canon, and it's said that it has an canonicity that's kind of like a text to follow, basically. So then these relationship or dichotomy of these two, people create derivatives based on canons, and because canon is an authoritative media, authors have sort of, well, as the term says, authority over the derivatives, and for being the value that it is a true thing, and all the derivatives are fake. And this is usually the picture that you will see if you take a look at copyright laws. And creating derivatives are basically copyright infringement, so the legal implication is very high. But then, are we living in a world where we are basically flooded with fake things? I don't think it sits right. And I think, well, I love doujinshi. I think derivative has its own good, different from canons. Maybe we should be asking questions about this dichotomy, or are they relevant? Is this dichotomy relevant at all? The issue here is that the canons and derivatives can swap and shuffle, because canons can be based on many other different media. Say, for example, if you imagine any European literature, you have to know something about Bible in order to understand the references they are making, in order to contextualize what the text is talking about. And in any culture, there's sayings, proverbs that's referenced in any of the literary works. There are also references based on a certain original thing, and the canons are basically based on it. That will mean canons cannot exist independent of other works. Well, it's kind of obvious, right? And especially when we are talking about the structures of narratives, it's full of references, full of alterations, full of active making derivatives. And so any materials can be canon and derivative at the same time, depending on what you have in hand. So when we talk about canons, we focus on the positions of the media with respect to what derivative you have in hand. Like, let's see. Well, this massive novel thing. I can see this is basically a novel, and this is based on Idolmaster. So this, with respect to this derivative, the canon is Idolmaster. But then there are people who are posting novels based on this thick volume, making it third level derivative. So if I take that web novel, this will be a canon. And seeing this kind of situation as an explanation to the philosophical postmodern theories, one of the Japanese critic, Azuma Hirok, described his concept of database consumption, and how he attempted to explain how the otaku as a consumer is consuming the otaku culture media in different way from the pre-modern or modern world. And his main points were basically the grand narratives lost importance, and people are not interested in it anymore. And instead, otaku is very much focused on characters that he says they are created from the database of tropes or moe yoso, and these endless generation of characters are what they are interested in, and how they consume the character. They are consuming characters, but also at the same time the whole vast database of tropes. And also he referenced Baudrillard and how the simulacra is flooding the market, and canon and fake. The dichotomy between canon and fake is blurred. I will say his theory is mostly true. I think his focus on the characters, the character obsession is very much true, and how the narratives are sort of deconstructed is very true. But then his depiction of otaku was that otakus were wanting narratives anymore. They just want characters and the settings that comes with it, which is kind of strange to us. The visual novel, in the later part of his book, he talks about visual novels and how they are paving the rise of importance of narrative among otaku, which kind of is self-contradictory. Oops, that was a little bit too fast. So I think his theory was true, but this otaku not wanting narratives didn't sit right with me. So this is what I'll be talking about most of the time later. But yeah. So what I'll be talking about is void, well, void with the quote double air quotes. And his theory offers starting point for me to talk about why people create derivatives, why create doujins, and with the focus on the whole concept of void or opening in canon, or even better, lack of a better term, easier insertion of non-canon materials. As I said, the character centrism is very much true. I think otaku is very much interested in characters, but then at the same time, I think people want the narratives at the same time. So I think the explanation has to take things into account so that the audience is wanting narratives and characters at the same time, and how they have a base. I said symbiosis, but how they exist and interact with each other, and essentially boils down to the fact that the narratives are now existing for characters, for the purpose of creating and making characters alive. Narrative deconstruction is kind of repeat of the same thing. The narratives are now deconstructed into smaller stories. This grand narrative concept is basically a worldview to explain certain phenomena, and they are now deconstructed is what most of the postmodernist French philosophers are talking about. And I will explain what this deconstruction thing is, or at least how the structure is kind of changing in the context of otaku culture. I will take example of visual novels. In the most simplified sense, visual novels look like this, in my mind at least. But then, okay, any games could take a different structure and have a even more complicated structures to the narratives. But the main point I want to make here is two things. And first is that after the ending choice, well, the choice here, the narratives are happening concurrently and in parallel, so that the stories kind of divide and happens at the same time. And the second point is that in visual novels, you usually have to repeat certain part of the narratives in order to complete the game, whether it's completing all these character ending, or gathering all the still images, sound, any other game mechanics they have. But then the visual novels, in Japan, it's on the decline, actually. It's the market size is shrinking especially since 2010s. But then at the same time, what we are seeing is that the script writers of the visual novels are now working on different mediums, such as light novels, anime, games, well, other kind of games, and many more. Take, for example, Urobuchi Gen. I think you've heard of the name. The script writer of Madoka Magica. He made his career in the visual novel market, and now he's writing light novels, anime scripts, and many more. Even live-action movies, he did some of them. So what we are seeing in 2010s at this moment is that the legacies of visual novels, especially how the narratives are told, are becoming widespread among other mediums in otaku culture. But then if visual novel itself is declining. But then if that's the case, what do we have? And I'll say social games once again. Social games or soshage, it's a really broad term. I don't think there's any defining definition to it. But I think social games have legacies of visual novels in many different parts. Visually, it looks very similar. The user interface is similar. Then the narrative structure is so that it's non-linear and also has a lot of repetitive, possibly harmfully repetitive elements to it. Take, for example, these screenshots. I said I like Idolmaster, so I'm using that. So as you see, there's a character at the center, then there's a text box here, then the other UI elements like skip buttons, autoplay, and such is hidden in this arrow on the top right-hand corner. And this is very much a way the visual novel is telling stories. And also, what soshage is very good at is keeping things perpetual. I think if you've played it, you've experienced the hell of gacha, or any events basically, depending on the game. They add everything perpetually through gacha, through limited events, through many things, but then usually carrying narratives with it. For example, the gacha cards usually have some kind of stories to it if you use it enough times. Then you might oppose to, if you're playing Fate Grand Order, maybe you disagree, but the whole main story is also a narrative that's added constantly. And these perpetual addition of narratives, I think, in my mind, is done so that the characters become alive. But then how do they add narratives perpetually? You have to have some kind of method to keep adding things. And I briefly mentioned making characters alive, which is my term for ideas about adding thickness to characters, making characters real through adding stories, episodes that's centered around the character. I think in a character-obsessed world, the characters become real to the audience, but at the same time, we know they are fictional, so they become like a fusion of fictitious but also real. This is kind of a strange existence, but that's what I think they are. No problem. Then real people usually have story to tell in the past, anything that reflects their decision-making process, their principles in decision-making, or how they interact with other people. But then at the start of any character, they don't have any, usually. Especially at the soshage, the most usually as limited as Magic the Gathering flavor text, basically, like 3-line things about themselves and nothing more. And narratives are added to this character through gacha and other things to make characters more thick. Well, not the double CCs, no. Okay, so I think, and the narratives they are adding, I think there are two main methods. First one, if you imagine kankore or any other one of those gijinka genre, they are adding stories or episodes of real-world things, but then making things smaller at a sort of episodic level so that they can add them to the character. For example, in kankore, the characters are basically based on the Japanese Navy ships and taking the episodes from the ships for example, they fought really well, then that's the episode the character was getting. Then others would be like they didn't fight at all, they torpedoed and died after 3 days of launch. Then that's the stories they have. And then the second type, I think, is that if you imagine bandori, or basically any idol-ish style soshage, where the stories are added by the official side of the game. But then these two are main direction, and I think these two almost always exist as a hybrid. Imagine Fate, the whole Fate verse, basically. What they are doing is referencing the real-world heroes from the history and taking the episodes to the character, but then the narratives happen in the Fate world is actually a creation. So it has the two elements kind of hybrid together. So in that way, the success of Fate Grand Order, how they transitioned from the visual novels into social games are very natural. It was a very suitable system to convert into social games. And I would also talk about this really strange concept I came up with, relationship descriptive, where, okay, I have to start with the second type of it. Imagine any of the idol-style social games. I said the narratives are added by the official side, but then usually they have to focus on the characters. But then there are limits to how you can add stories to characters. At some point, you'll run out of ideas. So, and the easier way to do it was to make the characters interact between them. And through that adding of relationship between the characters feel more real and feel more human, having interactions among other characters. And this leads the way for the official side to add narratives focused on the relationship between the fictional characters, so that the situation would be that the official narratives are like semi fanfic materials, like whether it's a boys love genre, whether it's a Yuri genre, or whether it's an M/F genre, and basically it sells to the audience as well, so that there's more incentive for them to describe the relationship for the characters. And to talk about the canons in recent world, I have to talk about media mix, and how the canons are becoming set of derivatives, basically. Some canons are created, usually the media mix happens so that there's a canonical material, whether it's any novel or anime or manga, and they get adapted into other medium, games, manga, or movies. But then in recent era, I think the canons are transforming so that the canon itself is expected to be media mixed, so that some of the canons, we cannot locate which one is the original canon, or the first work that appeared in the world. Take, for example, Love Live. What's canon in that project? Officially, it started as the magazine project where the readers can participate to create the world of school idol project, and create the characters, create the stories, and how they are voiced through voting processes. But then, if the project itself was started so that the media mix is in mind and will be media mixed regardless of how it sells, it will be sold as a manga, it will be sold as a voice drama, CDs, then eventually anime, then social games, obviously. So the central canonicity is now kind of being blurred in some canons we have. So this void thing, I talked about it, but I will explain it in a little bit more detail. And in the character-centric world, and the world where official side is adding narratives to characters will mean that fans can add narratives through if you use the characters and take canonicity of it. If you use characters, you can be considered as sort of canonical, following the original world, but then so it makes fans easier to add their version of narratives into characters. But then canons are also needed as a reference point to keep the deviation to a certain extent. And I'd also say this making the lowering of the barriers to make things canonical, adding fan-made narratives. I think there's an element to ending the perpetual narrative, especially with regards to social games, where narratives keep coming, and coming. And the only ending they have is the end of the lifespan of the business. Usually they end without any kind of narrative, the ending in narrative. So I think the addition of fan-made narratives are sort of the act to make things end for them, at least in their mind, as a sort of tangible form, that it has a clear end to it. So, yeah. But then I said with regards to history of doujin, people are creating their fanfic, non-official materials on the doujinshi medium from, say, we can consider them from late 19th century or 1960s at least. And this means this is nothing new, but then we have to explain why it's expanding. Why is it getting bigger? To explain that, I think we have to talk about the narratives, but then at the same time, the catalyst to that phenomenon, which is the forum or the tools that the fans have at hand. I'll be talking about the catalyst to the doujinshi trend, especially the tools and the forums that they can publish their fan-made materials. And forum is very, very important for any creative activities. It's a community. It makes community of authors and audiences, and makes things easier for the authors to publish their material, because the community shares some kind of context, some kind of cultural background, and some kind of references, set of references they have, so that the authors can be more certain of their work being accepted and being read in the way that they expect them to. And also, by having that community, the audience can also create and making the community environment sort of more accepting of creative input among that community. And basically, fans become creators at some point, and such community is very important for activities like this. So the first I have to talk about would be Comic Market. Oh, I made the years wrong. It's 79. It started in 1979, as I mentioned, and it's the largest doujinshi market event of that kind in the world. It's the biggest in Japan, so it's basically the biggest in the world. There aren't many similar events in overseas, with some exceptions in Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea, and some other East Asian countries, but this is basically the biggest in the world. And since its conception, it is expanding ever so rapidly in terms of the venue they are using. They are now using the biggest convention center in Japan and using all the space they have available for 3 days. And participants' numbers are growing, and the duration is expanding. It used to be 1 day, then it became 2 days, then now it's a 3-day event. Now from this summer, the event will be expanded to 4-day event because of the special situation about the Tokyo Olympics Games, and the Tokyo Big Site, the convention center, is sort of occupied by the Olympics-related constructions. And also the scope is very wide. It accepts any kind of doujinshi, whether whether it's a massive novel about an Idolmaster series, whether it's a love for sauna, whether it's research on Lotus Vard, anything could be included in. Anything could be included if they can find the space, which they're increasingly having a hard time of. And also, this comic market is interesting in the way that this event has fan-made sections, doujin section, but also the industry section, where the official materials are sold by the big names in otaku culture, like say Aniplex, Kadokawa, any of the big companies, many anime studios like Shaft, A1 Pictures, they all sell their materials at Comiket, making an event where it started as a doujinshi event, now having an official feature, selling official materials, but also fan-made materials at the same venue. And obviously, Comiket isn't the only doujinshi event in Japan. There are several different kinds of only events where it has emphasis on certain things, like the canons they are using. There's an Idolmaster focused events, there are Love Live focused events, there are token number focused events. If you think of any canons, there's a big chance that there's an only event for doujinshi artists. Some of them focus on the narratives, like say situations, the tropes, like certain kind of tropes, kinks. Most of them have a only event, and also the mediums. Some of them focus on original manga. Some of them focus on specifically novels. Some of them focus on critiquing of anime, and such. And this constellations of doujinshi opens more doors for amateur artists or potential artists to participate in publishing their material, because Comiket is just too big and too competitive to participate, and audiences cannot go around all the spaces they have. They're just huge. So this forum is easier for most people to access, buy, publish. And also, yes, online communities, they are very important. Mostly about Nico Nico. Nico Nico Douga is a movie sharing site with the unique feature of having a comment flow on the video. Oops, sorry about that. And that community gave rise to many things, including the topics that was talked about last night here, but also Vocaloids, mad movies, or AMVs in English, and just the participation through comments. Yeah, and especially Vocaloid was a very big thing, defining the Nico Nico culture in a way that some musically oriented people create songs through Vocaloids. Some participate through illustrations. Some participate through covers of their songs. Some participate in dance covers. Some participate in, say, 3D modeling for the videos, the mad movies of Vocaloid songs and such. And this gave rise to creators becoming mainstream entertainment businesses. One of the most major example would be the Yonezu Kenshi, who's now a very famous singer in Japan, one of the top chart artists in J-pop world. Last year, he performed at Kohaku Utagassen, the biggest song-oriented TV program in Japan. And he started his music career as a Vocaloid creator under the name Hachipi. And he made famous songs like, the ones I know would be like Matryoshka, I think. And he became very famous, and now Vocaloid creators are leading the Japanese J-pop music world, which is crazy. And the second example would be like the project Supercell, where one of the Vocaloid artists made a group with the illustrator to create a unit where they make their music, then the videos by first initially using Vocaloids, but then now they're using human vocalists to do their songs. And these communities created an atmosphere where everyone can participate in somewhat of a creative way, whether it's an illustration or comments, which was a very accessible tool for participating in a video. And also the sheer number of the size of the community brought many people together in this creative atmosphere. And because it was an internet community, it brought much more people than across Japan than was possible before the rise of internet. But then online isn't the only things. We have to talk about the real life tools as well. For doujinshi, the printing tools are like vital to creating the thing, because if you don't print them, it's not a doujinshi. So since Meiji era, this machine called the stencil duplicators became really common in Japan, where printing activities could be done by the single page of paper written by a special pen, and duplicate them by using the inks that went through the paper with the holes, so stencil. This became widespread since Meiji era, and by Taisho, in early 20th century, the small-scale printing companies became a thing in any size of communities in Japan. There were lots and lots and lots of printing companies in any small towns, especially catered for companies and local governments for them to print something. And this widespread printing companies had a very important implication for the minicom trend, or the private publishing trend in 60s. And by then, they're not using stencil duplicators anymore, but the printing companies were widespread, and any small groups could access the printing facilities at more affordable prices than, say, other methods of printing. And because many people are publishing minicoms through these kind of companies, the manga doujinshi artists also use these companies to print the manga doujinshi for themselves. But then, since manga is a very different medium to print than a document filled with numbers and letters, some companies gained enough expertise to specialize in manga printing. So today we have many different choices of companies who specialize in doujinshi printing at an affordable price for any size of doujinshi artists, and at any scale from, say, 50 books to 200 books, this kind of really small-scale printing at an affordable price. And also, another real-life tool is the courier service. Courier? Yeah. So if you print things, you have to bring it to somewhere to sell. But then doing that on your back or in a suitcase is kind of a hassle to do. I think if you ask any person at the Taidekuya here, they will say a lot of things about it. But in Japan, the courier service became a thing in around 1970s that challenged the traditional post. It offered accessible courier service from door to the door, and these were much better services than what they had, like the National Post or the Japan Rail courier service, just like Matkahuolto in Finland, but not using buses, but instead the railways. So from the early era of Comiket, people could send their books from their houses to the venue, say 3 weeks, 3 to 3 weeks beforehand, before the event, for the books to be allocated at the specified space they had, and they can send boxes of books, and they don't have to carry them from if you're living in, say, Hokkaido, it's gonna be a hassle to travel to Tokyo and sell them if you have this massive kilos of books. So this create things made things easier for many people. And it also offered affordable way for the artists to send their books to their fans directly. Like if some people cannot participate in events, they can send them afterwards through like bank transaction, and then send the books to them through mail, normal mail, or these courier services. And the Comiket or doujinshi event isn't the only place to sell doujinshi. There are doujinshi bookstores. If you've been to Japan, or especially Akihabara, you'll see a lot of these bookstores. But initially, the doujinshis were sold in normal bookstores, some of the accepting bookstores in their normal shelves alongside the commercial books, like Shosen Group bookstores in Jinbocho, Tokyo, or Mandarake in Nakano, Tokyo. They started dealing with doujinshi from very early on. But then some businesses saw the business opportunities to focus on the bookstore business to doujinshi, such as Torano Ana, Melon Books, Comics In, and you name it. There are several different kinds, but they emerged around 90s, where the doujinshi market was kind of on the rise and became visible. And now artists can send their books to the bookstores and to be sold at the Torano Ana or Melon Books locations, and it made the doujinshis more accessible, especially outside Tokyo, because before, the only way to get doujinshi would be to ask the author themselves and send them to you. But then with the doujinshi bookstores, they have more locations across Japan to buy the books, so it became more accessible. And later they started online e-commerce as well for doujinshi. So nowadays you can just basically order doujinshi like on Amazon, basically. So, after all these rushed talks about derivatives, doujinshi, and all that, what are we seeing in 2010s? I think my presentation boils down to these 3 points. First, the narratives changed its shape. They changed the shape so that it serves the characters not as a narrative itself. And it became deconstructed, as many of the French postmodernist philosophers mentioned. And because of this change, it's affecting fandom activities to grow ever so rapidly and create more doujinshi, resulting in the comic market and other doujinshi market expanding. And with this in mind, the tools also accelerated the trend, and it's becoming more easier, more accessible for the artists and fans to buy, create, sell the doujinshi. So I think that's all I have to talk about. So I think I'll be accepting questions for the remainders of time, but do I have time? Yes, I do, I think, for about 15 minutes. So if there's questions, raise your hand. The mic will come to you. Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm not sure about these things. Yes. Any questions, comments, responses? Unclear points?
Okay, hi, I'm Sarah. I want to ask, is there a reason why there is not much like ebook versions of doujinshi? Do you have any answer for that?
Okay. The question was, why is there less number of ebooks for doujinshis? And I think there are several reasons, but the biggest would be that most doujinshis are based on canons, and under Japanese copyright law, the creating such fan-made materials are considered copyright infringement unless you have consent from the canon or IP holders. So what's happening is that the doujinshis logic is just so that you can sell them, but you're not selling them actually. You are getting the costs for printing, and they are paying for the printing part of the things, and you're not gaining anything from the actual manga or anything happening on the page, so that the copyright is not infringed and is not going to be sued by the IP holders, is the logic. So that's why ebooks are kind of still struggling. But then in the world of original doujinshi, well, especially the R18 stuff, they have markets in ebooks, and they are now starting to sell them. Especially, I think there's a website for English audiences as well, English-speaking audiences. Yes, that, or similar kinds. And in Japan, Fanza is now selling, Fanza and DL site is selling a lot of these things as an ebook that's accessible from here, actually. Yeah. Any others?
So I thought it was pretty interesting how basically maybe the modern works are maybe kind of created with the purpose of maybe becoming so that it would be easy to make doujinshi out of them, and then they would become a big deal in the internet community and thus kind of create more popularity for the series. Mm-hmm. So basically the kind of doujinshi already, the derivative works already shaped the main work before they even exist in a way, which I thought was interesting. But do you think that it could be possible that in the future the animes themselves become like kind of a complete sideline thing, and if you don't follow the doujinshi, you're kind of completely out of the loop about everything? Could you see that as a possibility?
Okay, so the question was, with the rise of this fan-made materials, is the official materials like anime would be sidelined so that the fans have to follow the doujinshi? I think it's not going to happen, because for the purpose of creating, you have to have some starting point. And I think one of the slides I mentioned, the canons are actually reference points for most doujinshi artists to keep it within the realm of doujinshi based on X. So having creation of canon and the, like, say, anime wouldn't be sidelined, but then the doujinshi will take a bigger space in fandom activities to show your sort of obsession to that canon, I think. Yeah. The back with the green shirt. Yeah.
Yes, actually, sort of an answer to the previous question. Wasn't it like that in the 80s, that the kind of the fan culture and the OVA anime kind of coexist, that you can't understand those things if you haven't read those magazines and the whole culture was, but it was so much smaller, the circles were so much smaller that it was possible that the fans and the products kind of coexisted in those magazines, and you bought those OVA anime. But now anime is quite a bigger enterprise, so it can't go into such small circles anymore, I think.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, it's becoming big, and I don't think the shrinking wouldn't happen in several years forthcoming. So I think, yeah, your point is very, very valid, I think. Yeah. Any others? From here then. Next.
Yeah, okay, so relating to the earlier question also, I think Toho is kind of an example of that, where even in the Western fandom, it's kind of a joke that no one actually plays the games.
Indeed, yes.
And they just consume the fan products.
Yes, yeah, Toho was, I should have mentioned it. I don't know how I forgot it, but the Toho is a crazy world where the doujinshi creation is very deep and wide. And I think the Toho has one of these very openings to it. And the canons being sidelined is definitely happening in Toho world, at least, yeah. I think so. And any others? Yes, you're next.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. You mentioned the work that someone had written up about the anime culture or the Japanese culture kind of contradicting or being self-contradictory in that we focus on character-centric parts of the fandoms, but then he made a point where the narrative kind of gets sidetracked or is put into the side. And you said that it's a self-contradiction. Could you elaborate on that a bit more?
Okay.
Because I get the point that, for example, in visual novels, sure, we have more time to explain things through and whatever, but even then, there are subsets of the works that kind of hinge on only the tropes, and the tropes are just kind of hinged into the plot without kind of trying to blend them into a narrative, and they're just kind of there as a fodder for
Okay.
consuming.
So the question was about this my evaluation on the self-contradiction by the author Azuma. I think what I said was self-contradictory was that within his book about database consumption book, I think his theory is almost 80% correct. But then the evaluation on otaku not wanting narratives, just characters and settings, I think that's somewhat valid. But then within his book at the later chapter, he was mentioning, but then in visual novels, otaku is wanting ready-made narratives, and it is on the rise. Say, for example, nakige in visual novel, like the games to cry. He explained that people are wanting those kind of narratives, but then in the explanation of Evangelion that he made earlier, he was mentioning the otaku wasn't really interested in them, just the moe also character tropes. So that's what I wanted to conceive here, but does that answer your question? Yes. Okay. Any others? Okay, there.
Yeah, I came here a bit late, so I don't know what you were talking in the beginning, but
No
I
problem.
would still like to ask a question, maybe clarify some things. You talked about, or somebody asked about those ebooks, but as many of you know, there is those illegal sites that upload and scan those doujins to their sites. What do you think about those? Are they good or bad for the doujin community, in your opinion?
The question was about the scanlations of doujinshi. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
I guess scanlations. Yeah, scanlations
And scans itself, yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
and more so for those that are not like done in a kind of, I guess, legal way, but like, or without the author's permission.
Okay. The selling of doujinshi overseas, it's a very difficult question. It's the same question as the watching anime through, say, torrents. But then when I started living here, it is a practical limitation. It's not possible to access them unless you do it so illegally, which is a big issue. And I think the doujinshi has a even higher language barrier because the individual author, the artists are very small and they cannot really consent translations for publishment outside. The translators cost a lot of money, and currently what's happening is basically amateur translators doing all the things, scanning, uploading, and the typesetting. And I think that's necessary evil at this point, depending on which genre you are talking about. But for the most, I think, is it's not legal. Yes, it's not. It doesn't have consent, but the fans want things is kind of unstoppable. So I'd like to see in future the doujinshi being sold here as well, but it's kind of less accessible outside. So
Yeah, and do you think the authors mind that somebody is translating their doujin without their permission doing it?
Authors being translated without consent. Some are very accepting, but then finding them out through without consent usually means it carries. They react to it as an "don't do it," because because of the ebook logic as well. Like you are selling the paper printing costs and all this leeway logic. They are very reluctant to not being able to control where their creations go, and I think they are having a hard time accepting the. So most of them don't know they are being translated, but then if they know it, I don't think they'll have a positive opinions. I think.
Okay, thank you.
Any others?
Yes, hello. You mentioned that it's okay to sell doujin because it's a physical product, you're paying for the printed product. But how do you feel about services like Patreon or Pixie Fanbox where you're paying the artist possibly for fan art or doujin, but it's in digital form and such?
The question was about the use of Patreons among the doujinshi artists, and it's a very difficult question, yes, because the doujinshi is built upon the gray zone of the IP holders not suing them, but then at the same time it's technically illegal, and this creates some reluctancy towards the Pixar Fanbox, especially when it was launched among the doujinshi artists who focuses on the canon-based materials, like say these things basically. They had they were really reluctant to use them, and I think most users on Facebook, the Pixie Fanbox is original creators or the artists who also do original manga series or illustrations, and I think that logic still stays there. And personally, I think it's a great way to fund artists, especially in this world where artists are everywhere, and if you want to show support, you want to give something to them, and I think that's a great system. But then I think the reluctancy will not go away, especially with the context in Japan, I think. Any other comments, questions? All the way at the back. Whoops.
Hi.
Hello.
Loud. So one of the points for making doujinshi that I didn't really hear you go over is especially representation or a desire for representation, particularly among marginalized groups in Japan, especially the LGBT community, where LGBT relationships are not especially looked on in favor and are censored or blocked in media by either municipal governments or by publishers. And I didn't really hear you go over that as part of a reason to create doujin, and I'm wondering why that is.
Okay, so the question was why I did not mention the issues regarding or the doujin as a way for representation among the marginalized groups, especially LGBT people. I did not mention it. Okay, let me start. So I'm very aware of the function that doujinshi is serving as a representation tools, especially myself being in a Yuri-based fandom where the artists and audiences are and could be member of these marginalized groups, and but then in this presentation, my focus was a little bit more about the derivatives and how the canons, how the derivatives are created from the canons. But then, for the reason for creation, I think it's a very big, really big tool and the desire to create in such a way, yes, especially with regards to, where did I have it? A little bit more. Yeah. Well, especially among the BL and Yuri genre, it's very strong, and I think even outside of LGBT community, I think it's a very strong tool for them to do, and I think that's the method. That's the purpose that self-publishing is serving as a tool since the start of this whole doujin thing in Japan as well. But then, yes, I forgot to mention it. That is the short answer. Does that answer your question? Okay. Okay, so I guess it's about time. Well, thank you very much for coming. I was gonna say finish. I'll try finish. Kiitos paljon ja hyvä konia jatkoa.